The first issue of the humorous German magazine Fliegende Blätter, which translates into English as Flying Leaves, was published in 1844 by the Munich-based company Brown and Schneider, and it was the earliest of its kind in the country. For quite a few years to come, each issue was undated, although the years of publication are known. But more frustratingly, the illustrators who produced the images were uncredited and either unsigned or illegible, so the early examples will have to remain anonymous. Despite the magazine's considerable popularity with the German middle classes, there was little to no perceptible visual evolution in the wood-engraved printed images in the years and even decades that followed. And as I can't even name who created the images, I'm moving forward at a fairly brisk pace in order to arrive quicker at the more expressive later work. Among the few who can be identified from the earlier years was Wilhelm Busch, hailed by many as the father of the modern comic strip. It was in the late 1850s that he first appeared, and his sequential dialogue-free images frequently ran over several pages. He wasn't the only one pursuing this approach, and at the same time the less celebrated Max Hader was also producing similar narratives for the amusement of the readers. It was also around this time that the work of Niklaus Knilling, another illustrator who mercifully signed his name perfectly clearly, also began to appear. He was frequently less comedic in his intent than others and had a particularly precisely drawn style which translated well into engraved images when printed. But it wasn't until the later 1870s when the more distinctive work of Adolf Oberländer started to feature, and he went on to become one of the most enduring and recognisable visual stylists to work for the magazine to date. And along with the by now well-established Niklaus Knilling, he was largely instrumental in moving the magazine's visual content forward. This evolution was undoubtedly very much assisted by a move away from the use of wood engraving in favour of the transcription of drawings onto galvanised zinc plates. This change in technology allowed for considerably finer translation of the illustrator's original work, and the greater level of detail afforded by the process added greatly to the growing number of illustrators who were pursuing more distinctive outcomes than the late 19th century usually favoured. The 1990s saw the beginning of a golden age for Fliegende Blätter, due almost entirely to the significantly impressive graphic talent and wit of those who were contributing to its pages and covers. Alongside Oberländer, there were three in particular who joined the magazine and collectively pushed the visual content into a more contemporary and expressive range of styles. Adolf Hengler led the way, closely followed by both Emil Reinicke and Hermann Vogel. All three were significantly talented and expressive humorists, and Vogel was also among the earliest to have his images reproduced lithographically. He evidently welcomed the additional expressiveness and tonal shading lithography afforded him, and inevitably other contributors started to be equally persuaded by the increased control this method gave them. This inevitably led to even more graphic variety in the pages, even though the magazine would remain rather stubbornly monochrome for quite a few years to come. But even without benefit of colour, the illustrated humour now prevalent in Fliegender's pages was unrecognisable from what had been published a couple of decades earlier. And these recent arrivals continue to dominate the pages while quite a few others eagerly joined the magazine as the 19th turned to the 20th century. Johann Bahr and Theodor Gratz were conspicuous among others who carried on exploring the potential of social humour with an abundance of material drawn from a rapidly evolving contemporary society. And almost certainly due to the immense popularity of Vogel's charming fanciful images, noticeably more fantasy themes were also featuring, courtesy of comparative unknowns such as Leopold Rothaug. And Fliegender's popularity remained undiminished despite fierce competition from others who were embracing the use of colour, including both Meggendorfer and Lustige Blätter, and particularly the rising popularity of Albert Langen's Simplicissimus. The engaging comic work of August Rosler began to appear at this time, and he quickly demonstrated that he was a benign expressive humorist, more than capable of holding his own alongside the more established figures. In terms of his technique, he followed the lead established by Vogel, with ink lines and textural lithographic shading, and he evidently enjoyed making good-natured fun of his fellow Germans. Not much later, Hermann Stockmann made his debut, and like Rosler, his work was an instant success, with similarly satirical depictions of his fellow humans, and a pronounced fondness for a pre-industrial Germany. As you may have noticed, the staff and other contributors to Fliegende had to date been exclusively male, but in 1906 the female illustrator Käthe Olshausen-Schönberger had some of her amusing anthropomorphic animal images published in the magazine. But her appearance was only brief, and she will be the only woman ever to do so. As the first decade of the century turned to the second, the enviably expressive pen and ink drawings of Max Kronbach began to appear, adding yet more visual value to the magazine. More than any of the others, Kronbach had a distinctive ability, similar to many of those simultaneously working for Britain's Punch magazine, to create humour, even though the portrayals of his characters were only very slightly caricatured. And his manifest control and expressive use of pen and ink in his predominantly equine scenarios set a standard that few others could even come close to. And by this point, Fliegende Blätter was boasting arguably the most diverse, skillful and downright entertaining illustrators Germany had to offer at this time. The many ongoing contributions made by the magazine's various remarkably talented humorists continue to dominate the visual cocktail that was by now every issue. And they were joined by other distinctive stylists, such as the more representational, determinedly traditional Germanic imagery of Franz Zim. Then in 1914, following the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the Great War erupted. At first the conflict was quite widely ignored by the magazine and its illustrators, but as fighting continued beyond even the expectations of the most pessimistic on both sides of the conflict, the subject could not be avoided, and it featured with increasing frequency. But even as the war grew to dominate their work, the various illustrators generally approached the topic with a fairly good-natured, upbeat humour. Max Kronbach was among a minority of the magazine's contributors, whose work dealt with the subject of war with absolute seriousness, a position well suited to the credibility of his more representational work. And he created a large volume of pen drawings which evoked the turmoil of war, with depictions of German troops engaged in close-quarter combat with the enemy. Franz Zim wasn't quite as overt in his references, but he too used his talent for pure representational figure work to create images with obvious patriotic propagandist messages. But other than this pair, most of the others continued to either avoid the subject altogether or address it with broader upbeat humour. Following Germany's defeat in 1918, Fliegende returned completely to business as usual, with a continuing stream of contributions from their stalwarts and the same engaging blend of light fantasy, social humour and sentimental or comic nostalgic evocations of a rapidly disappearing Germany. And in sharp contrast to the images published in other magazines at this time, there was no significant bitterness or resentment evident in Fliegende's pages, that post-war Germany was now in financial ruins and the basics of life were in short supply for anyone other than the very wealthy. By this time virtually all images were being printed lithographically, and many were more softly tonal in their render. And even those who persisted with line only, such as Max Kronbach, were having their work printed lithographically direct from the original artwork. By the early 1920s, quite a few of the early contributors had either moved on, retired or died, and various newcomers, including the particularly distinctive modernist Wolfgang Wagner, started to appear with increasing frequency. And when in 1924 the management finally acquiesced to calls for colour printing, he was among the first to feature on the cover. And although monochrome continued to appear, it was now balanced with the diverse colour stylings of the more traditionally inclined such as Stockman and Roesler, alongside the conspicuously more modernist approach of the recent recruits such as Wagner and fellow newcomer Karl Storch. In 1928, Fliegende merged with its long-standing rival Meggendorfer Blätter, which now received lesser billing on a typographically overcrowded cover. But most importantly for the visual direction of the magazine, the merger brought on board a whole new cohort of talented and diverse illustrators. Arguably the most significant of these was Josef Mauder, a former footballer for Bayern Munich, whose loose comical work appeared with great frequency from this point forward, which was far from surprising as he was also appointed the picture editor of the newly formed magazine and consequently dictated its visual content. And although Mauder was dominant, there were others who had jumped ship from Meggendorfer, such as the highly distinctive Eugen Croissant, possibly the most individualistic stylist to grace the pages of the magazine, with a telling use of distinctively spiderish line work and equally absorbing application of colour. The significantly talented representational watercolour illustrator Karl Franz Bauer also made numerous appearances during the decade, and was virtually the only illustrative presence to appear regularly at this time whose work was not essentially comedic in nature. Similarly, Martin Klaus used his appealing blend of line and colour to great effect in the pages of Fliegende at around the turn of the decade, and more than most turned his hand to a range of styles and characterisation. Josef Mauer's stewardship of the visual content undoubtedly gave the magazine a new lease of life. And in addition to those already mentioned, there were also contributions from the now particularly obscure Hans Frank, the highly modernist sequential monochromes of comic artist Josef Wieron, and the more conventional but no less entertaining images of Gustav Traub, all of whom added considerably to the genial tone of the magazine. By this time, Germany was in a state of some political upheaval as Hitler's National Socialists engaged in pitched battles with more left-leaning groups in cities across the country. But you would have been aware of none of this unrest from the content of the magazine, which remained resolutely cheerful and inconsequential, and this continued to be the case even when the Nazis actually became the government in 1933. But although Fliegende had less to fear under the new regime than most, all satirical magazines in Germany were quickly left in no doubt that any criticism of the Führer or his policies would lead to very bad consequences for those who might be inclined to publish anything negative. And given the alternative, it was understandable that they all complied. But where other publications immediately set about creating sycophantic images in support of the regime, Fliegende compromised by remaining ostensibly apolitical. The visual evidence from the decade clearly shows that this was a period of consolidation for Fliegende Blätter, with very few new contributors joining those already mentioned in the wake of the Meggendorfer merger. Nevertheless, this was a formidable and particularly varied team of talented visual creatives, each of whom continued to pursue their own stylistic paths with increasing levels of wit and graphic skill. Mauder and Croissant continued to create the lion's share of the visual material, but the others were only marginally less prolific. By this point, Fliegende Blätter had become completely dominated by the use of full colour, although several of their key players also seemed to enjoy demonstrating their prowess with equally fascinating and accomplished black and white work. But for a magazine which had spent so long resisting the inevitable march of technological progress, the variety of styles and application of colour now appearing undoubtedly kept Fliegende among the market leaders. And the magazine's policy of remaining apolitical produced some of the finest humorous illustrations of the period, to the extent that the decade could be seen with some justification as a second golden age. Even when the Second World War actually began in 1939, you would still have been quite hard-pressed to know it from the pages of Fliegende Blätter. And when propagandist images did begin to appear in 1940, they generally took the form of not particularly scathing ridicule of the British as represented by their mascot John Bull, followed soon after by caricatures of Winston Churchill. But this more benign mockery wouldn't last long, and by 1941 the magazine had finally either been seduced or coerced into direct support of the Third Reich, an increasingly vitriolic mockery of the Allied leaders. By this point, both Roosevelt and Stalin were getting their fair share of abuse alongside Churchill, and it was Mauder who was manifestly leading from the front, with a torrent of increasingly hostile images. And all his colleagues joined in with visual assaults of varying intensity, as the previous more good-natured humour largely disappeared from the magazine's pages. And most reprehensibly alongside these negative portrayals of the Allied leaders were others which portrayed Jews as the evil puppet masters controlling the Allies' every move, using any number of unflattering visual metaphors. And although it was undoubtedly Mauder who created many of the more memorably loathsome anti-Semitic images, others including Max Bauer followed suit with apparent willingness. Among the more moderate was Eugen Croissant, who generally confined his immensely stylish and expressive wartime images to broader mockery of the Allies and their leaders, and as far as I can tell created no examples of directly anti-Semitic work, which seems to suggest that the creation of such condemnations was far from compulsory, even if it was clearly understood that they would earn favour from those running the show. This state of affairs continued throughout the war, with only the most occasional space made for anything other than propaganda. And ultimately the magazine was completely overwhelmed by its propagandist mission, which continues to grow in ferocity up to 1944. By this time many of the recent contributors had ceased to appear, and other than a few others, such as the strange line and wash images of a bucolic Germany populated with Aryan girls by Max Bauer, Fliegende had become completely dominated by Joseph Mauder, still more than ably supported by the loyal and conspicuously less rabid images of Eugen Croissant. But by the later months of that year, only the most maniacally dedicated Nazi could still believe that Germany could win the war, and it was at this point that Fliegende simply gave up the ghost, having notched up a remarkable century of uninterrupted publication. It's not a very pleasant experience, and certainly a salutary one, to see a magazine originally devoted to the blameless pursuit of laughter metamorphose into one so dominated by rabidly propagandist imagery. As an admirer of the pre-war work of both Joseph Mauder and Eugen Croissant in particular, to witness them increasingly turning their immense creative talents to the benefit of Hitler's regime is particularly painful. But while we should never forget what the war brought out in some of our fellow humans, I'm going to attempt to end this video more cheerfully, with a collection of considerably more escapist and harmless imagery drawn from the early years of this remarkable and remarkably long-lived humorous magazine.